She stood in the kitchen we'd remodeled together and told me I had nothing left. Not a house, not a company, not a family. My own children stood behind her when she said it, arms crossed, nodding like she'd just read them a weather report. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded once and walked out to my truck. 6 weeks later, her new husband knocked on my door holding a folder that would burn her entire world to the ground. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter Kessler. Everybody calls me Walt. I'm 66 years old. I owned a precision machine shop on Farmington Road in Peoria, Illinois, called Kessler Tool and Die. For most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard enough, loved hard enough, and showed up every single day for the people who mattered, they would show up for you when it counted. I believed that with everything in me. I was wrong. Not about the working hard part. About the rest of it. This is the story of the worst year of my life, and the one moment near the end of it that I will remember until the day they put me in the ground. Let me back up. Welcome to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. If you're new here, get comfortable, because this one takes some time to build, and it's worth every minute. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight, and let's get into it. I married Diane Wexler on the 14th of June, 1990, in a small Lutheran church on Knoxville Avenue. I was 30. She was 27. We had exactly $4,200 in a joint savings account and a 2-bedroom rental on Fry Avenue with a water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Ohio. I was working as a machinist at a plant that made hydraulic fittings, coming home every night smelling like cutting oil, and Diane was doing the books for a dentist's office 3 days a week. We didn't have much. What we had was each other, or so I believed for a very long time. In 1994, I took every dollar we'd saved and borrowed another $60,000 from a local bank on Main Street, and I opened Kessler Tool and Die in a 2,200 square foot building I leased on Farmington Road. Diane cried the night I signed the papers. Not happy tears, at first. She was scared. We had a 1-year-old son, Bradley, and a mortgage on a little brick house on Sherwood Drive, and I was betting everything we had on a machine shop with my name on the door. She stood by me anyway. For the first 10 years, she stood by me every single day. She answered phones in the evenings. She kept the books before I could afford to hire someone. Our daughter Nicole came along in 1996, and Diane raised both of those kids largely on her own because I was at that shop from 5:30 in the morning until 8 o'clock most nights, chasing contracts, chasing tolerances, chasing the kind of precision that keeps aerospace suppliers and agricultural equipment manufacturers coming back to a small shop in central Illinois instead of going to somebody bigger. By 2015, Kessler Tool and Die had 22 employees and contracts with 3 companies you would recognize if I said their names, which I won't, because that's not the point of this story. We'd paid off the house on Sherwood Drive. We'd built a new one, a 4-bedroom place out in the Dunlap area with a finished basement and a koi pond Diane had wanted for 15 years. I bought her that pond for our 25th anniversary. I remember standing in the yard with her that August evening, watching the fish circle and thinking I had done it. I had built the life I promised her in that rented apartment with the water stain on the ceiling. I want to be clear about something, because people who've listened to a few of these stories always ask the same question. Was I a good husband? I worked too much. I'll own that. There were school plays I missed, birthdays where I walked in during the last 10 minutes still wearing my safety glasses pushed up on my forehead. I know that, but I never once raised my voice at Diane in anger. I never once stepped out on her. I paid for every vacation, every car, every tuition bill for both of our kids at Bradley University and the University of Illinois. I built the floor she walked on for 34 years. I need you to hold on to that fact, because it matters for everything that comes later. The first sign something had shifted came in the spring of 2023. Small things. Diane started going to a gym on Allen Road 3, sometimes 4 evenings a week. She'd always been active, so I didn't think much of it at first. Then she started dressing differently for those trips. New workout clothes, the kind with tags I found later still in a drawer, never worn to actually work out in. She started taking her phone into the bathroom when it rang. Small things. The kind of things a man tells himself mean nothing because the alternative is unthinkable after 33 years of marriage. Then in September of that year, she told me she wanted to go on a girls' trip to Nashville with her friend Carol from the old neighborhood. For days, I drove her to the airport myself, kissed her goodbye at the curb like I had 100 times before. 3 weeks later, I was going through our joint credit card statement, the way I did every month, and I found a charge from a resort in Nashville for 2 rooms. 2. I called Carol directly, because Carol and I had known each other for 20 years, and she'd never once lied to me in her life. Carol went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then she said, "Walt, I wasn't in Nashville. I don't know what she told you, but I wasn't there." That's when I hired a man named Russ Denhart, a private investigator who worked out of a small office off War Memorial Drive. I told him everything. Told him about the gym, the phone, the trip that wasn't real. Russ didn't need long. 12 days later, he called me into his office and set a folder on the desk between us, the kind of folder that's thin at first glance and heavier than it looks once you open it. His name was Roland Voss, 68 years old, a retired commercial real estate developer with a house on Grandview Drive overlooking the Illinois River, the kind of house with a wrought iron gate and a circular driveway. Roland had been divorced twice before, and according to Russ's research, both of those marriages had ended with settlements that left Roland's ex-wives significantly better off than when they'd started. Diane had met him at that gym on Allen Road in February of 2023. By April, they were seeing each other regularly. By September, when she told me she was going to Nashville with Carol, she was actually spending 4 days at Roland's lake house in Wisconsin. I sat in Russ's office with that folder open in front of me, and I felt something in my chest I can only describe as a foundation shifting. Not collapsing yet, just shifting, the way you feel a house settle in winter, a sound you know means something underneath has moved. I didn't confront her that night. I want you to understand why, because it matters. My father used to say that a man who reacts in the heat of the moment loses the negotiation before it starts. I have run a business for 30 years on that principle. So I closed the folder, thanked Russ, and I drove home, and I made dinner for my wife, and I said nothing. Not because I was weak. Because I needed to know exactly how deep this went before I said a single word. It went deeper than I expected. It always does. I didn't know it yet, but the affair was the smallest part of what was coming. Over the following 6 weeks, I quietly reviewed every financial document I could get my hands on. Our joint accounts, the business accounts. And that's when I found the first irregularity that had nothing to do with Roland Voss at all. It had to do with our son. Bradley, 34 years old at the time, worked as a loan officer at a regional bank downtown. Sharp with numbers, always had been. I'd helped him get that job with a phone call to a friend 11 years earlier. What I found, buried in 6 months of statements, was a series of transfers out of the company's equipment reserve account, the fund we kept for machine maintenance and replacement parts, roughly $4,000 to $6,000 at a time, moving into an account I didn't recognize. 8 transfers over 5 months. Just under $38,000 total. Small enough that our bookkeeper, a good woman named Sherry who'd worked for me 11 years, hadn't flagged them as anything more than routine equipment purchases because the paperwork attached to each one looked legitimate. Vendor invoices, purchase orders, all of it properly formatted. All of it, it turned out, fabricated. I sat with that fact for 3 days before I called Ray Kowalczyk, an attorney I'd used for business matters for almost 20 years, a careful man with an office on Main Street, who never once in 2 decades gave me advice he hadn't thought through completely. "Walt," he said, when I laid it all out for him across his desk, "this is either a very expensive misunderstanding or it's fraud, and I don't think it's a misunderstanding. I want you to find out everything," I told him. "I want to know who set up that account. I want to know if my wife knows about it. And I want to know before I say one word to anybody in my own house." It took Ray's forensic accountant, a meticulous man named Preston Yu, 19 days to build the full picture. And when he laid it out for me on a Thursday afternoon in late November, I understood for the first time just how small a role the affair actually played in what was happening to me. The account those transfers were landing in belonged to Bradley. But the paperwork trail, the invoices, the purchase orders had been built using a vendor template that only 2 people in the company had access to, me and Diane, who still occasionally helped with administrative tasks even though she hadn't worked at the shop in any real capacity for over a decade. Diane had been generating fraudulent equipment purchase orders and feeding them to Sherry, who trusted her implicitly because she was the boss's wife, and Bradley had been receiving the money on the other end. I sat in Ray's office and I asked the question I already knew the answer to. Why? Ray slid one more document across the desk. It was an email recovered from the company's server from Diane to Bradley, dated the previous February, the same month she'd met Roland Voss at that gym. I'm not going to read you every word of that email, because some things a man keeps for himself. But the gist of it was this. Diane was already planning to leave me. She'd already decided. And she wanted, in her words, to make sure our son wasn't left with nothing while his father built up more and more for himself. She told Bradley the withdrawals were, quote, money that was going to be his eventually anyway, just moved up a little early, and that his father would never notice because his father never paid attention to anything that wasn't the shop floor. I read that line 3 times. Never paid attention to anything that wasn't the shop floor. The shop floor that had put both of our children through college. The shop floor that had built the house with the koi pond she loved so much. I didn't cry in that office. I want to be honest with you, because people expect that part of the story, and it just isn't how I'm built. I felt something colder than grief settle into my chest, and I felt it settle in permanently, the way concrete sets. Nicole, I said to Ray, my daughter, is she in this too? Ray shook his head slowly. Nothing in the records suggests Nicole knew anything about the transfers, he said. But Walt, I have to tell you something else, and I don't think you're going to like it. He was right. I didn't. 2 days after Preston you finished his report, before I'd said a single word to anyone in my family about what I knew, Diane sat me down at our kitchen table on a Sunday evening in early December and told me she wanted a divorce. She'd rehearsed it. I could tell, because her voice had that particular flatness people get when they've said something to themselves in a mirror a dozen times before saying it out loud to the person it's actually meant for. She told me she'd, quote, grown as a person over the past few years, and that she needed a life that reflected who she'd become. She never mentioned Roland Voss's name. Not once. She let me believe, for that entire conversation, that this was about her, about growth, about a woman finding herself at 60 years old. I let her finish. Then I asked her one question. I asked her if there was anyone else. She looked me directly in the eye, my wife of 33 years, and she said no. I want you to sit with that for a second, because that lie, more than the money, more than the affair itself, is the moment something in me finished closing. Okay, I said, if that's what you want. She looked almost disappointed that I didn't fight her on it. I think some part of her wanted a scene. I didn't give her one. Not yet. The divorce proceedings started in January of 2024. Illinois is what's called an equitable distribution state, which does not mean equal, but Diane's attorney, a sharp young woman named Kimberly Ashcroft out of a firm downtown, argued aggressively that because the business had grown so significantly during the marriage, Diane was entitled to a substantial share of its current value, along with half of the house on Sherwood Drive equity, half of our retirement accounts, and spousal maintenance given the length of the marriage. Here's where it gets complicated, and I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that broke something in me that I don't think will ever fully heal. Bradley sided with his mother completely. Publicly, loudly, at family gatherings where I was still, foolishly, showing up because I hadn't yet told anyone what I knew. He told anyone who'd listened that I'd, quote, checked out of the family years ago, that Diane deserved to finally live for herself, that I was being, in his words, difficult and controlling by not simply handing over half of everything without a fight. My son, who had personally taken nearly $38,000 out of my company using forged documents his mother created, stood in my own kitchen at Thanksgiving in November of 2023, before any of this had come to light publicly, and told me I needed to, quote, learn to let go of things. Nicole, my daughter, was harder to read. She didn't say much at first, but by February, under what I later learned was significant pressure from both her mother and her brother, she started pulling away from me too. Fewer calls, shorter visits. When I asked her directly, over coffee at a place on University Street, whether she thought her mother was in the right, she looked down at her cup and said, Dad, I don't want to be in the middle of this. I told her she didn't have to be in the middle of anything. All she had to do was tell me the truth about what she believed. She didn't answer that question. She just said she needed to go, and she left half a cup of coffee sitting there getting cold. I didn't know it yet, but that unfinished cup of coffee was going to matter more to me later than almost anything else that happened that year. By April of 2024, the mediation had turned into something closer to a hostage negotiation. Kimberly Ashcroft was pushing for 55% of the business valuation, on top of half the house, on top of maintenance payments that would have gutted what was left of my retirement. Ray Kowalczyk fought every inch of it. But I want to be honest with you. Even with everything Preston you had uncovered, even with the fraud sitting there in black and white, I made a decision in that mediation room that I've thought about every single day since. I didn't bring it forward. Not yet. Ray looked at me like I'd lost my mind when I told him to hold that evidence back. Walt, he said, this is your best leverage. This changes everything in this negotiation. I know, I told him. That's exactly why I'm not using it yet. I wanted to see how far they'd go without knowing I already had the answer to the question that was about to define the rest of my life. Did my family actually love me? Or did they simply love what I could still provide? I found out in May. On the 9th of May, 2024, a Thursday, the mediated settlement was finalized. I signed away 50% of the appraised value of Kessler Tool and Die, structured as a payout over 4 years. I signed away the house on Sherwood Drive, the one with the koi pond, because Diane wanted to keep it and Ray advised me that fighting for a house I couldn't afford to maintain alone wasn't worth the legal cost. I kept my truck, my tools, a modest 401k that had already been split, and a small rental duplex on Prospect Road that I'd bought years ago as an investment property and never told Diane the full value of, which turned out to be one of the only decisions from my old life that would matter later. That same evening, standing in the kitchen of the house I'd built for her, the koi pond visible through the window behind her, Diane told me I had nothing left. Those were close to her exact words. You built your whole identity around that shop and this house, Walt, and now you have nothing left. Bradley stood behind her with his arms crossed. Nicole stood a few feet to the side, looking at the floor. I nodded once. I said, all right, Diane. And I walked out to my truck, and I drove to a one-bedroom apartment on Knoxville Avenue, 3 miles from the church where we'd gotten married 34 years earlier, and I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a long time before I went inside. I moved into that apartment with a card table, 1 lamp, and a mattress on the floor for the first 2 weeks because I hadn't had time to buy a bed frame. I want to tell you those weeks were the hardest of my entire life, and that would be true, but it wouldn't be the whole truth. Because underneath the grief, underneath the exhaustion of losing a house and a marriage and, it seemed, 2 children in the space of 5 months, there was still that folder. Still sitting in a locked drawer in Ray Kowalczyk's office. Still waiting. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to need it sooner than I planned. If you've stuck with me this far, welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge Stories. Grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, because this story is about to turn in a direction I promise you didn't see coming. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight, and if you haven't yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling stories like this one. 6 weeks after the settlement, on a Saturday evening in late June, I was sitting in that one-bedroom apartment eating a plate of reheated meatloaf from a place on Sheridan Road, watching a Cardinals game with the sound down low, when there was a knock at my door. I want you to understand, nobody knocked on that door. In 6 weeks, I'd had exactly 1 visitor, a neighbor asking if I had jumper cables. So when I opened it and saw Roland Voss standing on the other side, in a golf shirt, no jacket, holding a manila folder against his chest like it might blow away, I genuinely thought for a moment I was looking at the wrong man. Mr. Kessler, he said. His voice was quieter than I expected. I know this is completely out of line, showing up like this. I wouldn't be here if I had another option. I stood in that doorway for a long moment, deciding whether to close the door in his face. I'd have been within every right to. Instead, I stepped back and let him in, because some part of me, the same part that had waited 5 months to use the folder in Ray's drawer, wanted to know exactly what would make a man like Roland Voss drive across town to knock on the door of the husband his new wife had just finished dismantling. He sat down across from me at that card table, and he set the manila folder in front of him, and he didn't open it right away. He just looked at me and said, Walt, has anyone ever told you what happened to my second wife? I told him I knew she'd left the marriage with a significant settlement. He gave a short laugh with no humor in it at all. Her name was Patricia, he said. We were married 9 years. About 2 years before she filed for divorce, money started disappearing from a business account I controlled. Small amounts. Never enough to trigger an audit. It took me almost a year after the divorce to figure out where it had gone. He paused. It had gone to her nephew, a young man she'd been quietly funneling money to for over a year before she ever mentioned the word divorce to me. I sat very still. I said nothing. I didn't think much of it at the time, Roland continued. I chalked it up to Patricia being generous with family. Poor judgment, nothing criminal. I paid my lawyers. I moved on. I told myself it was a fluke. He tapped the folder once with 2 fingers, not opening it yet. 3 weeks ago, I found almost the exact same pattern in my own accounts. Except this time, Walt, the transfers weren't going to a nephew. Diane set up a joint investment account 4 months ago, back in February, using a financial advisor your son Bradley recommended to her. She's moved just under $190,000 of my money into that account since March. Money I didn't authorize her to move alone. I felt that cold, settling sensation return to my chest, the same one I'd felt in Ray Kowalczyk's office 7 months earlier. I hired a man to look into it quietly, Roland said. A private investigator. And what he found, Walt, is that this isn't the first time. It isn't the second time either. There was a marriage before yours that I didn't know about until 3 weeks ago. A man named Edward Groff, in Springfield, back in the late 1980s, before you two ever met. Same pattern. Small transfers, family members involved, a divorce that left him with almost nothing. I want you to understand what that meant. My entire marriage, every year of it, every sacrifice I'd made, hadn't been the beginning of anything for Diane. It had been a chapter in something she'd already done once before. Why are you telling me this? I asked him. You got what you wanted. You got her. Roland looked down at the folder for a long moment before he answered. Because I'm 68 years old, Walt, and I built what I have the same way you built what you had. Slowly, honestly. And I am not interested in becoming Edward Groff, or you, 3 years from now, sitting in some apartment wondering where it all went. He opened the folder and slid it across the table to me. I need your help proving what she's doing before she finishes doing it to me. And in exchange, I have something in here I think you're going to want to see. Inside that folder were bank statements, wire transfer records, and something else entirely, something I hadn't expected. Copies of text messages between Diane and Bradley, recovered by Roland's investigator through channels I chose not to ask too many questions about, dated as recently as 3 weeks earlier. In them, Diane referred to Roland's assets using language I recognized immediately, because it was nearly identical to language from that email she'd sent Bradley about my company 18 months earlier. Money that would, quote, come to Bradley one way or another. A plan to move funds into accounts before Roland, quote, figured out what was happening. Same as before. Same as before. I sat in that apartment with Roland Voss until nearly midnight, and by the time he left, we had an agreement. He would continue gathering evidence on the current fraud against him. I would take everything I already had, the fraud against my own company, the forged documents, that email, and I would finally bring all of it forward. I didn't know it yet, but the woman I'd spent 34 years loving had built her entire adult life on a pattern she'd been running since before I ever met her, and I was about to be the one who finally stopped it. Over the following month, Ray Kowalczyk and Roland's attorney, a sharp litigator named Denise Farrow out of Chicago, worked in careful coordination without either family knowing the two of them were speaking. Preston Yu went back through every record with fresh eyes, cross-referencing the new evidence from Roland's accounts with the old evidence from mine, and the picture that emerged was more precise and more damning than anything I could have imagined on my own. Diane hadn't just taken money from my company. She deliberately structured the divorce settlement itself to extract maximum value, while simultaneously already courting Roland Voss, meaning she'd potentially committed fraud not just against Kessler Tool and Die, but against the divorce proceedings themselves, by concealing an ongoing relationship and financial planning with a third party during active mediation. Illinois law takes that seriously, and Bradley, my son, wasn't simply a passive recipient of stolen equipment funds. Text messages Preston recovered showed him actively advising his mother on how to structure the transfers from Roland's accounts to avoid detection, using knowledge from his job at the bank, the same job I'd personally called in a favor to get him 11 years earlier. Nicole's name appeared nowhere in any of it. Not one transfer, not one email, not one text message. I want you to hold on to that, because it matters for what comes at the end of this story. By late July, we had enough. Ray filed a motion to reopen the divorce settlement based on fraudulent concealment of assets and undisclosed relationship during mediation. Separately, and this was the part that took the most careful handling, he prepared documentation for a civil fraud claim against both Diane and Bradley related to the company funds, with the understanding that criminal referral remained on the table depending on how the next conversation went. Because there was going to be a conversation. I made sure of that. Nicole was getting married that September to a good young man named Ethan she'd been with for 4 years, and the engagement dinner was scheduled for the last Saturday in July at a restaurant on Grandview Drive, not far, as it happened, from Roland's house overlooking the river. Diane had planned the whole thing. Of course she had. She loved planning things that put her at the center of a room. I almost didn't go. Ray told me I didn't have to, that everything could be handled through paperwork and process servers, quiet and clean. But I thought about that half-finished cup of coffee Nicole had left on the table months earlier, and I thought about the fact that she deserved to know the truth from me directly, not from a court filing, not from a rumor, but from her father, sitting across a table, telling her plainly what had happened. So I went, and I brought the folder. The dinner was in a private room at the back of the restaurant, white tablecloths, a view of the river through tall windows, maybe 18 people total, family and close friends. Diane was there in a pale blue dress, glowing in the way people glow when they believe they've successfully rebuilt their life on someone else's foundation. Bradley was there with his wife. Nicole was radiant, sitting beside Ethan, and for one moment, watching her laugh at something her fiancé whispered to her. I almost lost my nerve entirely. Then Roland Voss walked in. He wasn't officially invited, and I want to be honest, that part was my decision, made carefully with Ray's blessing, because Roland had earned the right to be in that room when the truth came out, and because his presence alone was going to answer a question before I ever had to ask it. Diane saw him first. I watched the color leave her face the way it does when the ground shifts underneath someone and their body understands what's happening a half-second before their mind does. "Roland," she said, standing halfway up from her chair. "What are you?" "Sit down, Diane," Roland said quietly. Not cruel, just final. I stood at that point, and I picked up my water glass and tapped it once with a fork, the way you do at a toast, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when they sense something is about to happen that isn't in the program. "I'm not going to take long," I said. "Nicole, this is your night, and I'm sorry to do this here, but I've thought about it for weeks, and I decided you deserve the truth in person, not in a phone call after the fact." I looked at Diane. 7 months ago, before we ever sat down in mediation, I learned that nearly $38,000 had been taken from Kessler Tool and Die using forged purchase orders. I learned it went into an account belonging to our son. And I learned that you, Diane, created those forged documents yourself, using a vendor template only you and I had access to. The room had gone completely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard a chair creak as someone shifted their weight. I didn't say anything during the settlement. I continued, because I wanted to see something first. I wanted to see whether my family actually loved me, or whether they loved what I could provide for them. I got my answer in that kitchen on Sherwood Drive in May, when you told me I had nothing left. I let that sit for a second. You were wrong, Diane. I had something left the entire time. I had the truth. I just hadn't used it yet. Bradley stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. "Dad, this isn't the place." "You're right," I said, turning to him. "It isn't. But you didn't think it was the wrong place to text your mother detailed instructions on how to move Roland's money without triggering a bank flag either, did you, Bradley?" 3 weeks ago. I have the messages. I watched my son's face do something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not shock exactly. Recognition. The specific look of a man who has just understood that the floor he thought was solid was never solid at all. "Roland came to my apartment 6 weeks ago," I said, to the whole room now, though I was really only speaking to Nicole, whose hand had gone very still on the table in front of her, because he found out he was in the middle of the exact same pattern I'd already lived through. Diane has moved nearly $190,000 of his money into an account she set up in February, for months before our divorce was even finalized, while she was still legally my wife. And before that, in the late 1980s, there was a man named Edward Groff in Springfield. Same pattern. I have his name because Roland's investigator found him. Diane's voice came out thin, cracked at the edges. "Walt, please, not here. I asked you one question in December," I said, and for the first time all evening, my voice didn't stay perfectly level. "I asked if there was anyone else. You looked me in the eye and said no. I've thought about that lie more than almost anything else in this entire year, Diane. More than the money. Because the money, I can rebuild. That lie, I don't think I ever fully get back." I turned to Nicole last. Her eyes were bright, her hand pressed flat against the tablecloth like she needed something solid to hold on to. None of this touches you, I told her. Preston, you went through every record twice. Your name isn't on a single transfer, a single email, a single text message. You didn't know, and I need you to hear me say that clearly, in front of everyone in this room, because I don't ever want you carrying guilt for something you had no part in. I paused. I love you. I have loved you since the day you were born, and nothing that happens after tonight changes that. This is your night. I'm sorry I had to do this here, but I wasn't willing to let you build a marriage standing on a foundation of lies the way I did, without at least giving you the chance to see the whole picture first. I sat back down. I didn't shout. I never raised my voice once through any of it, and I want you to understand that was deliberate, the same way it had been deliberate 7 months earlier when I chose to sit on that evidence instead of using it immediately. Power that's calm is harder to argue with than power that's loud. What happened over the following weeks was, in its own way, quieter than the dinner itself, but no less final. The motion to reopen the divorce settlement was granted in September based on Diane's fraudulent concealment of her relationship with Roland during mediation. The revised settlement, finalized in November, restored a substantial portion of the business valuation to me, structured around the documented fraud, and included a judgment against both Diane and Bradley jointly for the $38,000 taken from the company, plus legal costs. Bradley was terminated from his position at the bank in October, once his employer became aware, through the discovery process, of his role advising in the movement of Roland's undisclosed funds. Banks do not look kindly on loan officers who use their professional knowledge to help conceal financial fraud, even fraud committed by family. He hasn't worked in banking since. Roland's situation resolved differently and more slowly. He and Diane separated within a month of that dinner. He didn't pursue criminal charges against her, in the end, largely, I think, because doing so would have meant airing the entire history publicly in a way that would have exposed his own past marriages to the same scrutiny. But he recovered the $190,000 through a civil settlement, and he sold the house on Grandview Drive within the year. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona. I don't know if he ever fully understood that the pattern he escaped was one he'd nearly become a permanent chapter of. I think, in his own way, that folder he carried to my door that Saturday evening was as much an act of self-preservation as it was a warning to me. I don't hold that against him. Self-preservation is a language I understand completely. Diane still lives in the house on Sherwood Drive, though considerably smaller than the one on Grandview Drive she'd briefly occupied. I'm told, through mutual acquaintances I no longer speak to directly, that she's had a difficult time finding work at 61, given how long she'd been out of any formal profession. I don't take pleasure in that. I want to be honest about that too. I don't feel joy watching someone struggle, even someone who did what she did. I feel something closer to peace. The specific, quiet peace that comes from finally not being lied to anymore. Bradley and I haven't spoken since the night of that dinner. He's reached out twice, both times through text messages that read more like negotiations than apologies, asking whether I'd be willing to help him find work given, quote, everything that's happened. I haven't answered either one. Ray tells me that's my right, and some days I believe him more than others. I loved my son for 34 years without a single condition attached to it. I'm still learning what it looks like to love someone from a distance, with the door closed but not locked. Nicole is different, and this is the part of the story I want you to sit with, because it's the part that made everything else worth surviving. She called me the morning after that dinner, before I'd even had coffee, and she asked if she could come by my apartment. She sat across from me at that same card table, the one I hadn't yet replaced, and she cried for a long time before she said anything at all. Then she told me she'd known, on some level, for months, that something was wrong with how her mother and brother talked about the divorce, the way they'd rush past certain topics, the way Bradley would get defensive if she asked too many specific questions about the business. She said she'd chosen not to look too closely because looking too closely felt like betraying her mother, and she didn't know how to hold both truths at once, that her mother had raised her with real love and also, apparently, built parts of her adult life on theft. I told her she didn't owe me an explanation. I told her the coffee she left half-finished on University Street months earlier had haunted me more than almost anything else that year, because in that moment I genuinely didn't know if I'd lost her too. She reached across that card table and took my hand, the way she used to when she was 6 years old and scared of thunderstorms. And she said, "You didn't lose me, Dad. I just needed time to see it clearly." Her wedding to Ethan happened as planned that September, in a small ceremony at a venue on the river, and I walked her down the aisle. Diane was not invited. That was Nicole's decision, not mine, and I respected it without ever asking her to reconsider. At the reception, Nicole stood up during the toasts, unprompted, and told everyone in that room that her father had spent 34 years building a life for his family with his own 2 hands, and that no settlement, no lie, no betrayal was ever going to change what kind of man he actually was. I did cry that night. I'll admit that freely. Some things a man is allowed to feel all the way through. Now, I promised you a sweet moment in this story, something separate from the reckoning, and here it is, because I think it matters as much as anything else I've told you. Sherry, my bookkeeper, the woman who'd unknowingly processed those forged purchase orders for months, came to me in August, mortified, convinced she'd be fired for not catching the fraud sooner. I sat her down in my office and told her the truth. She had trusted the boss's wife because that trust had been earned over 2 decades of dying genuinely, at one point, being part of this company honestly. That wasn't a failure on Sherry's part. It was a betrayal by someone who'd exploited exactly the kind of loyalty that makes a small business work in the first place. I gave Sherry a raise that month, and in January of this year, once the revised settlement finalized and I had control of the business again, I made her a full partner in Kessler Tool and Die, 20% ownership stake, the first partner I'd ever taken on in 30 years of running that shop. She cried in my office when I told her. She said she didn't know what to say. I told her she'd already said everything that mattered, every single day for 11 years, by simply being someone I never once had to doubt. That's the kind of loyalty I'd been chasing my whole life without realizing it was sitting right in front of me the entire time, on the other side of a modest desk in a modest office on Farmington Road, in a woman who never once asked me for anything and never once took a single dollar that wasn't hers. I moved out of that 1-bedroom apartment on Knoxville Avenue in February of this year. I bought a smaller house, just 3 bedrooms, on a quiet street off Prospect Road, close to the rental duplex I'd kept quietly out of the divorce all those months ago. I fixed up the yard myself over the spring, and in June, almost exactly a year after Roland Voss knocked on my door with that manila folder, I put in a small pond. Nothing like the one on Sherwood Drive. No koi, just a simple little water feature with a few goldfish Nicole picked out for me at a pet store on War Memorial Drive, because she said I deserved something quiet and mine, something nobody could ever tell me I built for the wrong reasons. I sit out by that pond most evenings now. Some nights Nicole and Ethan come by with takeout from a place on Sheridan Road, and we sit together and don't talk about any of it, because we don't have to anymore. Sherry stops by sometimes on a Friday with an update on a new contract, and I still get that same feeling I used to get in 1994, standing in an empty 2,200 square foot building with a lease I could barely afford, believing something good was still possible if I just kept showing up. I think about Roland Voss sometimes, out there in Arizona, and I wonder if he understands what he actually gave me that night he knocked on my door. It wasn't just evidence. It was proof that the truth, even delayed, even buried under months of silence and strategy, always eventually finds its way to the surface. My grandfather used to say something similar, that the truth doesn't rush, because it doesn't have to. It's already going to win. It just waits for the right moment to stand up. I lost a marriage. I lost a son, at least for now, and I'm not going to pretend that door will never open again, because I don't believe in closing doors permanently on people you've loved for over 3 decades. But I got my daughter back, whole and clear-eyed and standing beside me at her own wedding. I got a partner in Sherry who never once needed watching. And I got something else, something I didn't expect to find sitting in a 1-bedroom apartment with a card table and 1 lamp back in the worst weeks of my life. I got proof, finally, undeniable proof, that the man I always believed myself to be, steady, honest, someone who shows up and pays what he owes and tells the truth even when it costs him everything. That man was never the one who had nothing left. He was the only one in that whole story who never lost himself at all. If this story meant something to you tonight, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from, and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories like this one coming, and I'd love to have you back for the next one. Take care of yourselves. and take care of the people who never once made you doubt them. I'll see you next time.